I'm excited to share with you some work today that I've conducted in collaboration with my colleagues, in particular, Andrés Casas, Boaz Hameiri, and the late Emile Bruneau, on some work looking at how exposure to a media intervention could help promote support for peace and reintegration in the context of internal conflict in Colombia. And while I am really excited to share this work, it is a little bit of a bittersweet moment for me because this is actually the last project that I conducted with Emile Bruneau, who was someone who I think exemplified some of the best in justice and in morality, and whose work often, like the work that I'll talk about today, really sought not only to sort of advance psychological theory, but also to do it in ways that could have an applied impact in furthering and improving intergroup relations and helping make the world a more moral and just place. And this project is one that Emile was really the spearhead of, and I was lucky, I think, to be along for the ride. But in this work, sort of consistent with a lot of Emile's research, he was seeking to try to help improve intergroup relations. And in this work, we did so in a context that in some ways might be particularly tough to move around. We were focused on the attitudes towards support for reintegration and peace in the context of the conflict between the left-wing guerrilla group, the FARC, and the Colombian paramilitaries and government. And it's a conflict that's gone on for over 50 years and resulted in casualties numbering and disappearances numbering in the hundreds of thousands. And in general, when you think about internal conflicts, they're particularly challenging because the research suggests that they tend to have a relatively high degree of recidivism. So it tends to be quite possible for these conflicts, even when they sort of enter this post-conflict stage, to slip back into sort of repeated conflagrations. Now, as I mentioned, the conflict in Colombia lasted about 50 years. In 2016, the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, actually negotiated a peace deal with the FARC movement, which resulted in sort of the demobilization of the FARC in exchange for immunity from jail time for their past actions, as well as political representation. And as part of this peace deal, the idea was that the FARC would sort of lay down their arms and they would sort of reintegrate into Colombian society in phases. So they would first start in 26 reintegration camps. And when this proposal, or when this peace deal was struck, Santos actually held a referendum in Colombia to see if the Colombian populace would essentially sign on to this deal. And what happened is actually this peace deal narrowly failed. So you can see here, by less than half a percentage point, by about 50,000 votes, the Colombian public actually rejected the peace deal. Ultimately, the peace deal was somewhat revised, and a few months later, Santos actually ratified the peace deal through a different mechanism, so through the legislature. So they did not put it back to a referendum. Instead, they ended up actually getting it passed through the Colombian Congress. And what I think this example illustrates, or what this situation illustrates, is that whereas politicians are the ones that often broker peace deals, it's actually the public, the populace, that has to live the peace deal. So it's all fine and well to come up with a peace deal, but there's, in situations where the public doesn't buy in, there's a real risk for, as I mentioned earlier, recidivism, for the situation essentially to re-escalate. And in fact, it turns out in Colombia that the implementation of the peace deal has been choppy, and there have been meaningful challenges with reintegration, with sort of violence occurring, as I'll talk about a little bit, in some of these reintegration camps. And so what we were seeking to do in this work was to try to leverage some of the tools of social psychology to see whether we might be able to develop an intervention that could help increase support for peace, and importantly, support for reintegration, focusing on that post-conflict phase in an internal conflict like this one. Okay, so it's all fine and well to think about coming up with interventions, but how do you go about this intervention, both in terms of its implementation and its content? Here we were focused on so-called media interventions, simply by which I mean an intervention in which people engage in some way, shape, or form with content delivered through some medium. So that could be a written medium, visual medium. In our case, we focused on developing videos, as you'll see. Media interventions can be an alternative to what you might think of as logistically challenging in-person contact. So the FARC, for example, typically live in rural parts of Colombia. And in fact, most Colombians have never had, even though the conflict has been going on for 50 years, most Colombians have never actually engaged or met a person that formerly fought with the FARC. Media interventions also have the advantage of scalability. So in-person contact is obviously, as we know, one useful mechanism to improve intergroup attitudes and relations. But at the same time, in-person contact it's not easy to actually scale it up, and it can also require both the motivation and means to meet with the enemy. In contrast, actually developing a media intervention can make it easier to expose a large group of people, including people who might not have either the motivation or the means to meet with the so-called enemy. And another advantage, potentially, of media interventions is that they can be tuned to target specific psychological processes. So, of course, when you set up in-person contact, you can try to structure it in such a way as to result in certain outcomes. And we know that, in-person contact under certain conditions is more effective than under others. But you don't have total control over what actually happens when you bring people together. In contrast with media interventions, you can actually, whoever's designing the intervention can specifically tune it and target it to try to hit upon specific psychological processes that you might think are particularly relevant to the outcomes of interest. And there is some previous research that documents the effectiveness of media interventions of various kinds. So some work by Emile, Mina, and Rebecca Sachs showed that developing narratives that highlight difficulties faced by targets like the unhomed, the differently abled, or the elderly can be effective in increasing empathy for those targets. Work by Betsy Pollock and Rizarta Bilali and others has shown that radio soap operas in Africa, in places like Rwanda and Burkina Faso, have been effective. And these soap operas sort of focus on intergroup sort of events or conversations across intergroup boundaries, have been effective in shifting conflict-related social norms like obedience to authority, as well as support for violence, and reducing the tendency to compete over victimhood status. And then some work by Emile and Muniba Salim showed that the use of videos could effectively challenge the views of Palestinians as inherently violent. And some work that I conducted with Emile and Emily Falk showed that you could also use videos to highlight people's tendency to be hypocritical in what's known as their collective blame. In our case, looking at collective blame of Muslims, and collective blame being essentially the tendency to hold a whole group accountable for the actions of individual group members, which is something that we tend to do in a biased way. So you might hold all of Muslims accountable for the actions of the Paris attackers, but we don't tend to hold members of our group accountable, or the whole group, when it's the in-group, accountable for actions of individual members. So, for example, we don't hold all whites responsible for the actions of Dylan Roof in shooting up the church in Charleston, South Carolina. So media interventions as a category have been shown to be effective, but as I mentioned, you also want to think about, what's going to be the content of the media intervention that you come up with. And in trying to tailor the content of our interventions in Colombia, we followed a fairly bottom-up approach adapted from Hornick and Wolf, who've applied this approach in the space of public health. So things like, for example, smoking cessation campaigns. And their approach follows a number of steps. They start with a qualitative assessment to identify what they describe as sort of the superset of beliefs that might be associated with the outcomes that you're trying to change. So you want to try to look for, what are the friction points? What are the barriers to the target outcome that you're interested in? So in our case, we were looking at, what are some of the beliefs that majority non-FARC Colombians hold that might serve as friction points in causing them to resist support for reintegrating the FARC into mainstream Colombian society. From there, after sort of a qualitative assessment, you seek to quantitatively measure the candidate beliefs, the things that seem to emerge from the semi-structured interviews as potentially being relevant, both to measure the beliefs themselves, but also to look at their potential correlation with the outcomes of interest, things in our case like support for peace and reintegration. And from there, you choose the belief that you believe can be plausibly changed. So you want to look at beliefs that are reasonably prevalent and strongly correlated with the outcomes of interest, but also beliefs that you believe can be targeted effectively through a media intervention. Finally, you construct the media intervention that's intended and tuned to target the belief in question, and then assess it, ideally using a randomized study. So we followed this approach in trying to develop our intervention. So I'll tell you about several studies that we conducted, starting with semi-structured interviews in Medellin. Medellin is the capital of a region, Antioquia, in Colombia, that actually has seen some of the greatest violence historically with the FARC group. So we conducted some semi-structured interviews to begin to get some of those superset of beliefs that might be relevant. From there, again, following Hornick and Wolf, we measured quantitatively some of those beliefs and looked at their correlation with the outcomes of interest in a preliminary cross-sectional survey of Colombians. And then from there, we identified the target beliefs we wanted to impinge upon, developed intervention videos that I'll show you one of in a few moments, and conducted a two-wave experimental study. So a first initial wave and then a follow-up about 3 months, 10 to 12 weeks later, which we then replicated in a large pre-registered experimental study. And then we finally conducted an extension experimental study, again, sort of replicating some of our effects and extending them to more behavioral measures. All right, so this is some video that you're seeing from the semi-structured interviews we conducted on the streets of Medellin. So again, we talked to a variety of individuals, and what we asked them to do was essentially to tell us, both in terms of their own perceptions and in terms of their perceptions of other people's beliefs in their communities, what were some of the things that might lead themselves or people they knew to be resistant to reintegrating the FARC, to support for the peace deal. And several things came up, but one of the themes that emerged repeatedly was this perception of the FARC as unwilling and unable to reintegrate and to give up violence. And this might be familiar. In fact, one of the talks earlier today mentioned this notion of perceived malleability. So this is sort of consistent with this idea that, you know, the FARC are fixed in their ways and they're not really going to be willing or capable to change their ways and be effectively reintegrated. And the way that we measured this construct, you know, one sample item here, pretty face valid, you know, members of the FARC are unwilling to get along with others in Colombian society. I should mention this was, again, not the only candidate belief. You'll see that this is the one that we ended up trying to target most in our interventions. So other things that came up, for example, were the idea that the FARC were not really being honest in their desire for a peace deal. Similarly, some people, you know, brought up the fact that they believed that the FARC had not been held sufficiently to account, that they hadn't really faced sufficient justice as a reason for not wanting to support the peace deal or support their reintegration. But this was one of the beliefs, this perceived malleability, one of the beliefs that was not only prevalent. So as you can see, this was measured on a scale of 0 to 100. The mean here is about 60. So many Colombians seem to hold this attitude. You also see, you know, some reasonable amount of variation, but this was a fairly prevalent perception, but it was also correlated, as you'll see, with many of the outcome measures of interest. So we were interested, for example, in blatant dehumanization of the FARC, which we assessed using the assentive human scale, which pictorially captures what you might think of as lay perceptions of evolvedness, going from a chimpanzee to a full human. And so we looked at sort of ratings of the FARC on that 0 to 100 chimp to human scale. We also supplemented that with ratings of overtly animalistic traits, like seeing the FARC as brutal or savage. We also looked at support for peace using, again, face valid items like I support the peace process. And then perhaps most importantly, support for reintegration policies. Again, these are all multi-item scales, but a sample item here was, you know, we should invest public resources in job training programs for demobilized members of the FARC. And keep in mind, you know, if the peace deal with the FARC is to be successful, things like job training programs are going to be especially critical. So, you know, the members of the FARC, in order to support their military activity, often were engaged in things like farming coca leaves and the narcotics trade, essentially. In order to have a lasting and effective and durable peace, one of the things that was recognized as being important was coming up with job training programs that could help the FARC reintegrate away from some of their previous activities and towards things that were perhaps more societally acceptable or more mainstream. So policies like this are, we think, quite important. So in terms of the correlations, what we found is across the board with these outcome measures, robust correlations such that, the more people thought that the FARC were lacking in malleability, unwilling and unable to reintegrate, the more they dehumanized them, the less they supported peace, and the less they supported these reintegration policies. So next, we wanted to develop interventions, media interventions that could be targeted at attitudes and beliefs like this. So we actually went out to one of, and I should say Emile went out along with some local filmmakers to one of these 26 reintegration camps in Antioquia. And what we did is we essentially interviewed former FARC members in the demobilization camp. Now, this demobilization camp, as you can see, is in a rural region of Colombia, but it abutted two small villages. So not only did we interview members of the FARC, or the former ex-combatants from the FARC, we also interviewed members of the neighboring communities, as well as some of the police that were there, intended essentially to protect the peace and to also protect the former FARC ex-combatants from retribution from other guerrilla groups that had chosen not to give up arms. Now, one thing I should mention is we did not explicitly ask the individuals, can you please comment on how willing and able you are to reintegrate and give up violence? But instead, knowing that there had been promising and positive developments in this community in terms of its relationship with their neighbors, we simply asked them about how life was like in their community, expecting that some of the content, some of the video that we got back from these interviews would allow us to construct a media intervention that highlighted through the words that these individuals were saying, their willingness and ability to reintegrate into Colombian society. So I should mention, we actually developed several interventions. So I'm going to focus on primarily the integration version, the one that really sought to target specifically this perceived malleability. You'll see that there are 4 versions of it, as I'll describe why in a moment. We also created another version, again, from the same interviews with the same people, that was targeted on this belief that the FARC were uninterested or not serious about an actual peace deal. We also interviewed the daughter of a FARC ex-combatant who actually was born in jail because her mother was imprisoned and was separated from her mom from the ages of 3 to 16, where she lived as part of the foster system. That video was intended to generate empathy for the FARC. We also had a video with the Colombian policeman who spoke about the ways in which the former FARC ex-combatants were treating him with respect and empathy. And then finally, we actually also tested a video that had been created by the journal Nature to highlight sort of an interview with scientists that highlighted some of the trauma that members of the FARC had experienced, both sort of leading up to why they joined the group, and as well as the trauma that they had experienced sort of in the years participating in the conflict. So the reason we had multiple edits of the integration in the peace video is because we also looked at the role of message order. So the core video that I'll show you in a moment, what we wanted to do was to present testimony essentially from the FARC ex-combatants, but we also reasoned that perhaps majority non-FARC Colombians would sort of discount this testimony if it wasn't corroborated in some way by members of the neighboring villages. So in the V1, we started with which is the sort of core intervention that I'll test throughout, or I'll show you the results of throughout. We started with the testimony from the FARC ex-combatants, and then there was sort of corroborating information from the neighboring members of the neighboring villages. In version 2, we simply reversed the order to see if message order mattered. And in version 3 and 4, we simply had only just the FARC or just the members of the neighboring communities. And we basically did the same thing with the FARC peace video. And this was just a sort of supplemental interest point for us to see, how important might message order and message content be even when you're trying to target the same psychological process. All right, so I'll show you just a snippet, a 2-minute snippet from the FARC integration V1, the core focal intervention I'm going to focus on today.
Él está viendo ahora que llegó al espacio que ustedes tienen acá una comunidad cerca, pero también está la policía, están los militares. ¿Cómo ha sido ese relacionamiento con ellos? ¿Ha sido difícil? ¿Ha sido fácil?
Al principio fue un poco complicado porque todo el mundo tenía sus temores. Se fue construyendo esos lazos de amistad, de entendimiento, y todo fue gradualmente, pero fue avanzando. Hasta ahora, pues, creo que hay una muy buena relación, tanto con la comunidad, tanto con el ejército, tanto con la policía.
Pues una de las cosas, primero que todo, es la confianza, o sea, de entrar en confianza, porque la realidad, lo que hemos tenido aquí, la confianza y la integración, porque nosotros no le hemos podido dar nada, más nada. Confianza, integración y amor, afecto, cariño a las comunidades.
Ellos dicen, ¿cuántos de nosotros no queremos que nos muevan de aquí? Porque aquí nosotros venimos, jugamos fútbol con ustedes.
Nos dijeron que hay un equipo de fútbol.
Sí, aquí hay un fútbol mixto.
Mezclado.
Sí, policía, soldados, comunidad y excombatientes. Ya se organizó el equipo de fútbol de mujeres. Ya fueron y jugaron en Dabeiba y derrotaron al equipo de allá.
No, hemos trabajado muy de la mano, actividades, arregla de camino, arregla de carreteras, que una ayuda para una señora pobre allí, que hay que hacer una rifa, que hay que hacer una venta, vender boletas, un bingo, pero que hay que colaborar. Siempre lo hemos hecho.
Nos ha tocado aquí en este espacio trabajar de la mano todos juntos en el arreglo de la carretera. Soldados, policías, defensa civil, las dos comunidades, aquella y esta, nos ha tocado.
Okay, so that was just a 2-minute clip of about a 6-minute video. So let me show you a little bit of the results here. So as I mentioned, we conducted the study in 2 waves. So I'm focusing just on this version of the intervention. I should note with respect to the message order, this one was directionally actually the most effective, but because all 4 of the variants were effective, there was actually not a statistically significant difference. It was simply directionally the most, and I'll talk a little bit more about message order later. But this is what we find at the first time point. So starting just immediately after exposure to the video, we find a significant reduction in the belief that the FARC are unwilling and unable to change, as well as significant reductions in dehumanization of the FARC, a significant increase in support for peace, and a significant increase in support for policies that would help with reintegration of the FARC. We then followed up with a second wave, as I mentioned, about 10 to 12 weeks later. And what you can see is that approximately 3 months later, you see that the effects are reasonably consistent, reasonably stable. So we still see a smaller but stable effect on perceived malleability, as well as effects on dehumanization, support for peace, and indeed support for FARC reintegration. Now, one of the things that we thought was interesting about this video is that the video was really aiming to target a cognitive perception, this belief that the FARC were unwilling and unable to change, perhaps more so than a more affective route of sort of driving empathy or reducing prejudice against the FARC. And so we were primarily interested to see whether the effects of this intervention were specifically driven by this cognitive mechanism that we had tuned the intervention to try to target. So I'm going to show you a structural equation model that's quite complex, but I'll just highlight the most important point here. We're looking at wave 1. What we find is that, yes, in fact, our intervention was significantly mediated by perceptions of the FARC being unwilling and unable to change. At wave 1, you do also see that it reduces empathy and reduces prejudice. Increases empathy for the FARC and reduces prejudice against them. But in fact, if you look at the indirect effects, they're significantly stronger through perceptions of perceived malleability. And when you look at the second wave, you find that the effect on prejudice has actually faded. And again, we find that the sort of significantly strongest mediator of our effects is through this perceived malleability that the intervention was targeted for. And of note, some of the other interventions, including some that were successful, like focusing on trauma that the FARC had encountered, did actually operate more via empathy as opposed to perceived malleability, as one might expect. So we then followed up with an experimental, pre-registered experimental follow-up. So now we were focusing on just this focal intervention and the control. So about 400 to 500 participants per condition. We found here that we broadly replicated our model. So the effect on dehumanization was significant. The effects, the direct effects on support for peace and support for FARC reintegration were marginally significant. But again, we found significant indirect effects through perceived malleability as predicted. And then finally, the last experiment that I'll show you, we wanted to, again, replicate these effects in a pre-registered design and extend them to looking at behavior as well. So what we did is we first presented participants with a series of resumes that sort of followed the traditional template in Colombia for resumes. And what we did is we included in these resumes information that would have made it clear based on the region that they were living in, that these were former FARC ex-combatants. And across a variety of different professions, we looked to see the extent to which people thought that these resumes or the individuals in these resumes were hireable for the professions that they were applying to. And then in terms of looking directly at behavior, we also gave people a bonus and we gave them the opportunity to donate to a charity called Tejendo Paz, which is essentially a charity that is run by former FARC ex-combatants. And in this particular group was working during COVID on developing essentially masks that could be distributed. And so we looked at the proportion of people's bonus that they gave to this charity that was essentially helping to employ FARC ex-combatants. So we had about 700 people per condition. And what we find with respect to assessments of applicant suitability, we again sort of replicate this effect of the intervention such that people who saw this intervention that changed the perceptions of FARC individuals' willingness and ability to reintegrate, thought that they were more suitable, more hireable in professions, again, consistent with these types of reintegration policies that are necessary for a lasting peace. And with respect to their behavioral donation, we see a small but significant effect such that people were more willing to actually donate to Tejendo Paz. We're seeing here on the y-axis essentially the percentage of people's bonus that they were willing to donate. So just to conclude, I think this work provides some evidence that a media intervention featuring parasocial contact, which is to say you're not engaging directly in contact with the other group, but you're sort of witnessing others engage in contact with the outgroup, seems to promote peace in a context that's marked by long-standing internal division, lots of many hundreds of thousands of deaths and a lot of destruction. It seemed to operate primarily through this more cognitive versus affective mechanism that it was tuned to really try to touch on. And there's other work in this space, not in terms of internal conflict so much, but other work by Eran Halperin and Amit Goldenberg in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, looking also at trying to affect perceived malleability that also shows similar positive effects. These effects seem to persist across a 3-month period. We found some evidence that it affected both attitudes and behavior. And I also think this work adds to a growing body of work on the importance of meta-perceptions, because part of what the sort of concern that was raised by Colombians is about, by non-FARC Colombians is about, is that, you know, they see us in this aggressive way. They're not going to be willing to come in and reintegrate in society with us because they view us with hostility. And there's a lot of work coming out by people like Samantha Moore-Berg and Jeff Lees and Mina Chikara and others showing that meta-perceptions are actually quite an important driver of conflict attitudes and behaviors. In terms of future research, I think it's important that future research actually examines the intervention in the field. So while we collected we sort of developed the media intervention from the field, it's also important to test it beyond the online samples that we used. For example, you know, you could imagine exposing a city or a town but not others, to the intervention and seeing whether sort of random assignment to exposure to a media campaign in some cities or towns actually drives real world behavior in them. Of course, it would also be important to assess the effects over longer periods of time than that which we considered. It's important to build upon our proof of principle intervention. So we showed that, you know, one media intervention, 1 6-minute video that could help change perceptions of malleability, willingness and ability to change among the FARC. But of course, there may be other ways to target this particular psychological mechanism. And, you know, as psychologists, we focus on psychological interventions, but of course, there are other things that are not about psychology that are really important in conflicts like this. So there has been a bit of a slide back towards violence in Colombia. And part of that has actually been because many of the former FARC combatants have experienced deathly lethal violence in the camps by members of other militia groups. So just as important as psychological interventions is actually potentially protecting the physical and psychological safety of members of the FARC who have chosen to demobilize. The government's also been slow in following through on some of their promises, like helping them to farm different crops rather than cocoa. And then finally, I think it might be valuable to further explore the impact of message order and driving attitude change. We found limited evidence in this particular study that how you constructed the intervention, that even how you sort of ordered the same exact content might matter. But we think that there could be some promise here that there may be certain psychological differences in the ways in which you present information, even if the content itself is in general the same. So with that, I'd like to close by thanking my collaborators, Emile Bruneau in Memoriam, as well as Andrés Casas, who's from Colombia, and Boaz Hameiri. And thank you all for listening.